Thank you for taking the time today. I want to welcome everyone that might be viewing online, whether live with us in this moment or after the fact. Thank you so much for your interest and your time. We have a special opportunity today to have a cool conversation with folks within the mayor's office. So we'll start with introductions and then just jump right in. So my name is Josiah Gilliam. I'm the My Brother's Keeper coordinator in Mayor Bill Peduto's office. It's a city and countywide effort focused on Black men and boys, a collective impact process here. And I'll be the facilitator for today's conversation. Next up, Majestic Lane.
Yes, thank you, Josiah. Good afternoon, everyone. Majestic Lane, Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief Equity Officer for the City of Pittsburgh. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Faye?
I'm Faye Shala Akintola. I'm the Special Initiatives Manager for Mayor William Peduto. And that means I get to manage Welcome in Pittsburgh, which is our immigrant and internationals integration work, work on Census 2020 in partnership with Allegheny County, work on international relations as well. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And Alette?
Hi, everyone. My name is Edith Mohammed. I work as a policy coordinator for the mayor's office. I work with many different offices and commissions within the city of Pittsburgh, but within Welcoming Pittsburgh, I work closely with Faye on census, implementing the Welcoming Roadmap, and tracking it.
Thank you so much, Allah. With us on the conversation today, we have two wonderful ASL interpreters. We have Logan and Joy. Thank you two for being here with us and being a part of this conversation. We appreciate you. Let's start with some framing questions and talk about the work of welcoming. Chief Lane, Welcoming Pittsburgh is a key initiative in the Office of Equity, but could you just for a moment frame what the Office of Equity does and how the mayor's office and city government thinks about equity writ large, and then we'll get down to the individual work.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Josiah. The Office of Equity in the mayor's office is really just about acknowledging the fact that, you know, for all of us to succeed, for any of us to succeed, all of us have to succeed. And thinking about populations that traditionally are not thought about when it comes to city government is an important thing and an important distinction to really make a city welcoming, as you'll hear, but also compassionate, and important to make it a 21st century city. A city that does not try to include all of its residents, it's going to have a trouble and have a problem being a 21st century city. So the Office of Equity is about how do we identify those populations and how do we work on things until the point where race, gender, orientation, country of origin, ability, or any of those things are not a stand-in for the quality of life or a stand-in for disparities that people may suffer from. That is the goal.
Thank you, Chief. So you mentioned the idea of us being a 21st century city, and we're going to talk about ways and this idea of a new normal. Let's start with the historical context just for a minute. How does a city go about embracing or supporting and engaging with newcomers, especially in a place like Pittsburgh that has had so many waves of immigration of immigrants and newcomers coming to the city over years? How do you kind of walk that line, and how do you think about it?
Well, I think about it in many of the ways that the city has had many of waves. So we're fortunate in that we are a city that is made up of a lot of different people from a lot of different places all across the world, right? And so when you think about where folks came from Europe, or whether folks came from the American South, you know, from Central America, or from all over the world, that's just a part of Pittsburgh's DNA. So really the welcoming work is, what is the 21st century incarnation or the 21st century way to really look at how Pittsburgh has always invited people to come, always supported people when they come, and always welcomed people when they came into the city. People may be coming from different places, but the idea of being welcoming, of being a city that attracts all, and being a city that engages all and becomes stronger because of our immigrant and newcomer population is really one with how we've been for hundreds of years.
Thank you, sir. So you and I were just on a My Brother's Keeper committee call with leaders from around the region talking about the work of folks serving Black men and boys. And there's a lot of intersections that comes along with that work. But when people, they sometimes aren't easy to see for folks that haven't considered it or haven't considered an equity lens. And when people ask me about that idea of intersections, I most often point to the Welcoming Pittsburgh work because there are Black people in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, this side of the Commonwealth, and just the United States that are not African American, that may be immigrants, that may be refugees. Given those intersections, what's the role of equity in the conversation that we have around these things in the current state of the work now?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think one of the things that comes out of this conversation is that around intersections and around understanding the intersections of people's identities and understanding the intersections of how people show up in the world, right? So it's about, okay, you could be a black man and boy, but you may not be what people may call African American, right? We have a large, Somali Bantu population who, have been involved in work around MBK, although they wouldn't be qualified in some people's senses as Black Americans, right? So you see those intersections and you try to build on the intersections. And another thing that you recognize is that equity means different things in different situations. In some senses, it's a program. In some senses, it's a resource. And sometimes it's access to language. Sometimes it's access to different foods that other people may not eat, right? So we have to keep in mind that equity doesn't look the same to everyone. We should be looking to produce the same outcome. But the means of which that we go about our work around equity doesn't always look exactly the same, but it serves the needs of the people. So when we're looking at welcoming work and immigrant work and newcomer work, there may be things that are unique to those communities that they need, but they're all about trying to make sure that it is an equitable, welcoming city for people to engage in.
Thank you, sir. Let's bring you in. Faye, we'll start with you. Before we get to your role and the history with the work and what we need to cover on the call today, how are you doing today, and how has life been for you?
Thanks for asking, Josiah. I'm doing well. I'm trying to balance being grateful and at the same time acknowledging the fact that sometimes I feel really down. This is a very, I don't want to say sorrowful period, right? So being honest with myself about sometimes it's okay to be happy and sometimes it's okay to really admit to yourself that things suck right now and could be better. So, but ultimately I'm well. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. So can you describe your role when you talk to people about the work that you do on a day-to-day basis? What is your role and how do you describe the Welcoming Pittsburgh work?
That's a very good question. I think it just depends on who's asking. Sometimes the way I like to describe my role is I serve as a bridge between our immigrant refugee international community and the mayor's office. I also like to paint it in a way that my role exists to be able to identify any barriers, right, that prevent our immigrant communities from thriving in the city, right? So if it's language access, if it's access to certain resources, my role is to kind of figure out, okay, what is the issue, work with community partners to figure out what that issue is and then create a pathway, a bridge to help mitigate those issues. Ultimately, it's to make sure like our immigrant, refugees, international community know that the city of Pittsburgh is their home and they should feel the right to take advantage of it as they see fit.
When we say that Pittsburgh is a welcoming place or that Welcoming Pittsburgh is an official initiative, what does that mean?
I would say knowing that Welcoming Pittsburgh started way beyond before I got into the mayor's office. So I would say, depending on who you ask, my past predecessors, they might have had different responses. But the way I try to look at it is the fact that when the mayor was coming into office, he knew, to Chief Lane's point, the fact that there have been communities historically that have been left behind. And as the city of Pittsburgh was going through this new wave of a second renaissance of the city, he was intentional about the fact that, hey, you know what, we need to make sure that our immigrant communities are not left out. And in what way could we incorporate that? And I think Welcoming Pittsburgh and the idea of how the roadmap came about was just perfect, right? Because it was made up of different community discussions that happened throughout the city. It was hearing people's feedback. It was then the mayor then selecting 40 advisory council members to work with the consultants to kind of compile the needs and the concerns of the community. And then saying, like, pretty much my role and Allah and our public ally, Destiny Perkins, our role is to kind of work to make sure that we fulfill that roadmap in collaboration with community partners. And making sure, again, that we are creating a welcoming space and we're intentional about it when we do that. Thank
you so much. Just one final question, and we'll turn to Allah. diversity is an often used buzzword, and I think sometimes it gets thrown out there in a casual way. But diversity is really an accurate term to describe this work. To your point, what I hear you saying is, there have been different people that have worked on this at different times that bring their perspective and their lenses, and it impacts the work. You're working not just within city government, but with an array of community partners at different times on different initiatives, different projects. They bring their lens, their lived experience, their realities impact the work. When you talk about, or when you think about diversity as it relates to welcoming Pittsburgh, what are your thoughts there? How do you describe it?
That's a really good question. I think it's always hard to be able to answer that. Diversity, again, to your point, it's you come with your own lived experience, and I could say, as a Nigerian, I go through this in my head all the time. Sometimes it's about how you identify, and hopefully we'll go into this a little bit later. But sometimes it's hard to be able to choose what you identify with, because depending on the setting, you become someone different. And I'll give an example in terms of, I was born in Nigeria, but I've lived in the States the majority of my life. So depending on paper, I put down African American. If I'm with other Africans, I would definitely say I'm Nigerian. When I'm with other Nigerians, then it becomes a little bit segmented. Okay, you're Nigerian, but what are you? What tribe? Then I become Yoruba. And then with Yoruba, then it becomes what Yoruba land are you, right? So it just becomes so much more segmented, right? The more you get more, you get more deeper. And with that, again, we all bring our different perspectives. So to the welcoming work, it's realizing the fact that like immigrants and newcomer communities is very complex, right? And knowing that we're not monolithic and people could be one of so many different things, and keeping that in mind when we're approaching this work, having an ear to knowing that, okay, like I don't always have it right, understand the Asian American Pacific Islander community, understanding the diaspora of Latinx community, understanding the European community, and to Chief Lane's point, the communities that have come before, and having space to know that, okay, like all of those people have different experiences, and to create an environment where we're able to listen and able to know, like, okay, how do we incorporate all these people's perspectives in moving things forward for the city? So I would say it's a dynamic experience. It's challenging, most definitely, but it's also very unique for me because I get to get a little bit more insight to things that I would say other people might otherwise not.
It's extraordinary what the proximity, to this work can introduce to your experience, like the organic chances to learn from so many different people over time, and then in real time is really fascinating. We will dive in a little bit further on that. Alel, let's bring you in before we get to your role and your history with the work. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Josiah. Thank you for asking. Like millions of Muslims around the world, I'm observing Ramadan, and it has been one of the strangest Ramadans that I have lived through. It's a month of community gatherings, and that part has been taken away and is sorely missed. But I also, to echo what Faye was saying, I'm so grateful for everything that I have. And the gratitude is also really real. So thank you. How are you doing, Josiah?
I am doing well, and all the much more good because I'm on the call, with you all, and I'm finding things to be grateful for day by day, and trying to extend myself grace in those lower moments as well, and trying to be as supportive as possible to the people in my life too, as they're going through a lot of these waves. It's an extraordinary, and at least for my life, unprecedented shared experience that I'm having with so many people. And so I'm very grateful for the joy that I find, and just grateful to kind of, find steps. Governor Cuomo on a recent call mentioned the phrase "stone by stone through the morass." This idea that you're looking for the next step, the next bit of solid ground to advance a project, to bring some light to something, to connect people with resources. And I have been able to find those, and working on a team like this has really given me a lot of opportunities there. So I'm all the much more grateful there. So thank you for asking. I appreciate that. If you wouldn't mind, would you please share your role and how you came to work with this work, or to work on this in the mayor's office, but then also just as something you've been involved with for years and years. So I'd be interested in what you'd share with folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I came onto the mayor's office as a policy coordinator last September, and Before that, I come from a background with nonprofits, and specifically a network. I worked for a network that worked with many nonprofits, and so I consider myself really lucky to have that knowledge and skill set. A lot of my focus before joining the mayor's office was how to increase collaboration, specifically within the immigrant and refugee inclusion sector here in Pittsburgh. And so to come on to the city and work with Welcoming Pittsburgh, I'm able to bring that lens and continued dedication to collaboration, both within the city and different city departments, but also outside of the city as well. Like my last job was about connecting people to each other, and I think now a big part of my role alongside the rest of the Welcoming Pittsburgh team in the Office of Equity is to connect people to resources.
That's really useful framing. Thank you. So let's do some level setting for the rest of this conversation. I think all three of you have spoken to the idea of like the ecosystem of organizations, different levels of whether it's government, nonprofits, foundations, universities, individual community leaders, neighborhood groups, etc., that are involved with this work. And then there's this, all these Venn diagrams, so to speak, of overlap in terms of people working on things together, and then different initiatives and stuff like that. And as such, it's a chance to acknowledge the language that we use to describe the work, and like definitions for what it is that we're focused on. So let's just jump right into that. What are some terms that we should keep top of mind for this conversation? And perhaps if there was something that we could leave behind in terms of language that's not useful or that is perhaps divisive or unproductive, how would you all counsel us there?
That's a really good question, Josiah. And again, even in discussing this, is to also acknowledge again that terminologies are just really complex, right? We know race, ethnicity, different framings are just very complex things. So even as we share definitions with you guys, is to keep in mind that people want to be addressed the way that they want to be addressed, right? So for instance, an immigrant is a person who moves into a country other than that of his or her national origin, right? Like I explained, I was born in Nigeria and I came here, and I've spent the majority of my older life here in America, but I still will consider myself an immigrant, even though I am a citizen of the country as well. So it just depends. A refugee is a person who has left their country and are afraid to go back. So they're fleeing either because of war, they're fleeing because of persecution due to their religion, political beliefs, or race. So that's the terminology for refugees. Asylee is a person from another country who arrives in the United States for protection. And then undocumented. And normally what we hear, I've heard people say this a lot about illegal residents. So if I were to say what are the terminology to leave behind, it would be that idea of calling people illegal. In using my own thoughts, and of course you would hear different viewpoints from different community partners that we work with, but I feel like no one is in a place to tell someone that they're illegal or not. We're all legal on this earth. The person who created us, the God who created us for a reason. So there is no reason why someone should say they're illegal by being in this country. But normally the terminology that people should use is undocumented. And undocumented is a person who enters or stays in a country without those proper documents that might be needed for that particular country. But again, an immigrant, a person who's coming from that lives in a country like the United States, but were born somewhere else, a refugee who is fleeing, not necessarily because they want to, but to protect themselves and their families. An asylee, a person that's already in the U.S., but is asking for protection to remain here, just to protect themselves and their family. And again, undocumented, not illegal, was a person who is now in the United States without proper documents.
Okay, thank you. The rest of the team, any additional thoughts on that, the importance of language and what kind of terms are used most often with the work?
Yeah, I think it's important to really be clear about our language and understand that language evolves. But that language is political and language can be hurtful and harmful. So just as Faye talked about, just the idea of illegal versus undocumented, or acknowledging what it means to say someone is a refugee. And that's just really about being a good neighbor. And sometimes being a good neighbor is about knowing how to communicate with your neighbor, right? And knowing how to be a friend and how to be welcoming. And language is often a really big part of being welcoming. So I think it's a process for all of us to evolve, to understand the kind of language that we need to utilize in order to engage with all of our residents, all of our brothers, all of our sisters, all of our citizens. And it's a thing that you have to practice in yourself, and that then you have to share with others, so others understand the possible negative and harmful impacts of language, because language can elevate and at the same time language can desecrate. So we want to be very thoughtful. So Faye, thank you for bringing that point up around the importance of language and how we need to share that information with as many people as possible.
That's well said, Chief. No, go ahead, La.
I was just going to say, I want to also echo a point that you made earlier, Faye, about the dangers of lumping people together. I mean, even just the word immigrant contains so much diversity and experience within it, let alone all the other categories that you walked us through. And so when we say we work with the newcomer communities, or the communities that we work within welcoming Pittsburgh, there is that danger that comes with assuming that everyone has a shared experience, or that these are a group of people that are helpless and need our help. There's this strong, there's an urgency here that I would like to bring up, to remember agency and remember that these people have such a diverse range of careers, classes, wealth, language needs, statuses, and that is something that I think is often forgotten when we talk about helping people or helping the newcomer communities.
That's well said. It makes me remember a conversation that we had earlier about even the fact that we identified this terminologies exist for immigrants, refugees, asylees, so on and so forth. At some point, how long could you stay in the United States until you become an American, right? Like, is it, so we know we've had refugees here for over a decade, over 20 years. At some point, would we consider them refugees, or at some point they would say, like, I am an American just like you, right? So to echo Chief Lane's point, last point is the idea that being mindful of terminology allows us to be neighborly, right? To be welcoming and giving space to actually, when you're speaking and meet someone, letting them be able to share with you how they choose to be identified with. If they want to say, I'm an American, and they're proud of it. And they say, like, I am a refugee, I'm an immigrant, so on and so forth. It is respecting people's right to select what they choose to be.
Thank you so much for that for that overview and the nuance there. Let's try to keep it in mind for the rest of the conversation. I want to get right to some of the COVID-19 realities that you all have been facing as a team. So you are playing such an intermediary role. You're hearing from community members, community organizations at different levels, working on different things. What would you share to us, both of you share to us, about what you've been hearing, what the experience have been, and then let's talk about how you have pivoted yourselves as welcoming and within the mayor's office to be impactful and to be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry, my neighbor has chosen to mow her lawn, so there's some background noise that you guys are going to get. But we want to say that first and foremost, during a pandemic, I don't know if you can still hear me or not.
We can still hear you. It is noisy, but okay. I love the choice of being outside, so we're going to roll.
All right. So when COVID-19 broke out and this became an emergency, I think the first and foremost, we pivoted towards communication, and it became our number one priority. So we reached out to dozens of stakeholder groups within the Immigrant Refugee Inclusion Work Network, and we created an email listing so that it was really easy for everyone to reach each other with just a click of an email button. And we convened a call with all of these different stakeholders, and we heard about what the needs were that they were facing in their work, and based off of the needs that we were hearing, we reached out to even more people, service providers that can address those needs. So whether that was within healthcare or education, and we continue to convene those stakeholders every single week in coordination with those service providers. And so those weekly calls have been a really important staple in our ability to hear what newcomer communities are facing right now and what challenges they are trying to overcome. And I just want to say that in terms of what those challenges are, a lot of the inequities that we're seeing right now are not new, right? They've just been made more clear during this pandemic, but the challenges themselves are not new. And so the people who are working with the newcomer communities, they've been doing this work for years and years. And the challenges that they're seeing are similar to challenges that a lot of people in Pittsburgh and across the country, across the world are facing. So they want access to small business resources. They want to figure out healthcare, navigating the healthcare system. They want access to food. They can't make rent or utility payments. They need technology in order to attend school or complete their education, or maybe they've been facing discrimination and that discrimination is at an all-time high right now. So in terms of accessing these resources, this population that we're talking about has even more barriers to overcome. Mainly because we have to ask ourselves, are we utilizing the proper channels to communicate to communicate with these communities about the resources that are being put out there, especially if we're talking to people who may or may not be familiar with systems to know where to go to access resources. Are we providing these resources in languages that these communities can understand? So right now, our job is to advocate for these communities as resources are being created, that they are created with these communities in mind, so that they are accessible, and make sure that they are then funneled to the right community organizations and stakeholders who work directly with these newcomer populations and assist them every single day. And I just want to say that Welcoming Pittsburgh will be hosting a Facebook Live with those newcomer stakeholders so that people can hear from the people who are doing this work, the front lines of doing this work, who are the people that we also get to work with within Welcoming Pittsburgh.
Thank you so much for that. So I'd like to get a little bit tactical, since we have you two and you've been on the front lines of doing this exact thing. So you mentioned that you got like an email listserv going that you could share among the community so folks could contact with each other. Everyone could be contacted at once. What other ways, what other methods have you used to do that communication? And I remember the conversation we had 2 days ago around the critical communities work, and there's this idea of accessibility and accommodations. Here's a perfect example of that, where you want to connect community members with resources, but can you do it in a language that they can engage with, that they speak, and trying to get down to that micro level of making sure that communication is possible. What other tools and methods have you used?
That's a good one, Josiah. And I would say primarily, of course, we have the weekly calls that Ala addressed. And I think in addition to that, something that we do is we create room for people to tell us what needs to be done, like what needs to change, what isn't working. And with that, we do follow up one-on-ones, right? So we would just, after the session, we would meet or convene or speak to that leader in particular. I remember one of the community leaders had spoke to Ala, myself, and just said, hey, I really encourage you talking to this particular leaders, and gave us a list, and we did, and we followed up. We found out unique challenges that were going on that wasn't necessarily being addressed on our weekly calls. So that was a great way for us to figure out, okay, who are other agencies, who are other authorities, right, that we need to be working with. And as Alaz mentioned, we serve as connectors, right, not just within body of government, but with other authorities. And even now, the opportunity to even work across the city, the county, and even within southwestern Pennsylvania, as we know that our immigrant communities are not just stagnant in one particular place, but they flow between cities and municipalities and areas. And we know that they all have needs. So how are we working across different agencies to meet those needs? So again, it's one-on-one sessions with community leaders outside of the weekly calls. We're also working in partnership with All for All. So they send out surveys on a weekly basis that allows us to collect data on what are the needs from the Somali Bantu community, from the Burundi community, from the Western African community. What are those unique needs, and how can we make sure, like, okay, the resources that we're compiling, the agencies that we're working with are also connected to this particular groups. And to be honest, we've had to do that. We've had to, outside of calls, if we're finding out that things aren't working, we work behind the scenes to make sure that we connect those leaders with those authorities and say, okay, there is a gap here, and how can we make sure that we're fixing that gap? And sometimes it takes back and forth, but ultimately what's great, especially during these times, is that people are really sensitive to the needs of communities. And to Allah's point, this is not anything new, but what's great and what COVID has provided, it's an opportunity for people to be a little bit more sensitive than before, right? And people are very eager to help. And we're seeing that people are more patient and saying, okay, yes, I could explain the process to you a little bit different. We could try to go around to make sure like your community's needs are met with food distribution, for instance. Shout out to our deputy chief, Lindsay Powell, who really worked to make sure like our Somali Bantu community that, before when food was being brought up, we had pork in it. And some of our communities are of the Muslim faith and don't eat pork. So she worked with other agencies to make sure that, hey, like, the food that was being brought up was sensitive and made sure that it was able to meet the needs of the community groups there. So again, working with different partners and agencies to make sure that our communities are being met.
And to add on to that, like Faye said, we've been working with All for All to distribute surveys to get feedback on the resources we've been distributing to people. And we've also compiled an FAQ document to put all of those most commonly asked for resources and questions into this one place that we're happy to share out with everyone. And that has continued to also be a good resource for everyone.
That's tremendous. Thank you both so much. And we'll make sure that that's not only linked up in the broadcast, but that folks can go to the COVID-19 page and to the Welcoming Pittsburgh channels to find that information and engage as makes sense. I just want to acknowledge you two because once we started working remotely and making all these shifts with COVID, Welcoming was definitely one of the first initiatives to start with not just with the weekly calls, but with Zoom and broadcasting and these things like that. And you also have been on the front lines of new policy that's been passed in the middle of a global pandemic. New policy officials speak on behalf of the city of Pittsburgh related to the work that you do. I'd love to learn more about how that all took place. This is related to housing discrimination. Can you just talk to us about it, share what happened and who was involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So the legislation that you're referring to was introduced about 2 weeks ago, but has been in the works for maybe over a year now. And what it did was it added actual or perceived citizenship status and actual or perceived language spoken as protected classes under Title VI of the city code. And I want to give a bit of background about what that actually means. So we worked with the council person who introduced this legislation, Erica Strasberger's office, and the Commission on Human Relations on this piece of legislation. And the Commission on Human Relations investigates discrimination against certain protected classes. And so that includes race, sex, sexual orientation, religion, disability. They have a list of protected classes that they investigate discriminations against in spheres of employment and housing and public accommodations. And so what we did was we added actual or perceived citizenship status and actual or perceived languages spoken to that list of protected classes to enable the Commission on Human Relations to better prosecute these cases that they were already seeing. And this wouldn't have been possible without key stakeholders. So as I mentioned, councilpersons Erica Strasberger, but also the many community members and leaders who have informed this over the last year. So we have Wasi Muhammad, Sundrop Carter, Camden, Monica Ruiz, many wonderful community leaders. But then there's also Hirsch Merenstein, who is our colleague at the mayor's office. And I name all of these people to get at a crucial point, which is that welcoming work includes so many different specialties of work. So anything that we do within welcoming, Faye, Destiny, and I, we don't do it alone. The rest of the Office of Equity, the mayor's office, the rest of the city, and the community play a crucial role in incorporating a welcoming lens into every aspect of equity. And I just wanted to hit that point home.
And just to add on to a last point, I think it just really stuck with me what Chief Lane had really tried to push in the Office of Equity meetings a lot. And I remember when we had when we normally have our one-on-one sessions, something that he said was, you have to use government to move the work of welcoming Pittsburgh, right? So it's not knowing that there is no way that we could be in many places at once. And he just kind of encouraged us to have that kind of outlook, like how could we use the rest of city government and ultimately the Office of Equity to serve as tentacles to the work of welcoming Pittsburgh. We're so privileged in the Office of the Office of Equity to be able to have so many different managers and experts in early childhood and critical community space that Laura spoke in small businesses and minority contract businesses, so many different work. And we know that we can't be experts in those particular areas. But what's great is we have colleagues that as they go in those and moves in those specific spaces, they bring the lens of welcoming, right? So in early childhood, how are we making sure, like our immigrant youth are incorporated? With small businesses, how are we making sure that they are aware of the fact that they could bid for particular contracts? To a last point that she mentioned earlier, with small business resources, as COVID-19 is allowing, of course, small businesses to go through a lot of challenges during this period, how are we making sure that immigrant communities are aware of the loans and opportunities that they could take advantage of during this time? So again, he's using city government and especially the Office of Equity to carry the work and the lens of welcoming into different spaces. And just to be able to bring it back to legislation, again, is to know that, again, we're not just doing this out of the ordinary, but this was actually part of the Welcoming Pittsburgh roadmap to begin with, right? The roadmap kind of states, one of the recommendations says, continue to work for local, state, and federal immigration reform. And this just shows the commitment that the administration has. And of course, it's the Welcoming Pittsburgh team to make sure that we're fulfilling that recommendation. And again, to a last point, it goes beyond the Welcoming Pittsburgh team, the mayor's office. It's also working across city council. It's working across different cities. We work with Cities for Action, Welcoming America. And together what we do is we work on legislation together. So we've done things around DACA, around public charge, around increasing the amount of refugees that is allowed to come into the United States, so on and so forth. We continue to push legislation, both state, locally, and federally, to make sure that our immigrant communities know that, one, our administration is not just saying we're welcoming, but we're doing whatever we can to make sure it's legislatively proven as well.
Thank you, Deputy Chief. I wonder if we get you, if you would share with us about this. I remember I'm also relatively new to the mayor's office, and when the Office of Equity got formed, you began an internal initiative around interdisciplinary teams. And this seems to kind of speak to that same idea. What does this say to us about the role of government and the commitment of the mayor and the mayor's office when you hear these reflections?
Well, one, I wanted to say that, you know, the work that Faye and Alaa are talking about is really exceptional work working with the community, and not just kind of working for a community, but staying connected to a community, understanding the specifics of what's going on within that community, and really identifying some of the good things that are going on, as well as the challenges that are happening in that particular community. So I want to commend them for their work and also their ability to foster partnerships with nonprofits, with organizations, with other forms of government, whether Allegheny County, other folks regionally. So I think the work that we're talking about is really a testament to how do you work across those sectors, how do you sectors to be able to advance things that are important to a population. And so in that sense, the idea around the interdisciplinary team is really knowing that the things that we're talking about span one silo. So a great example of this is really thinking about the economic development possibilities for the immigrant community, for the welcoming community, and really was looking at, okay, we have this set of things that are occurring, and they've been framed for folks here who understand how to utilize them. And then let's say, for example, in a racial context, in a class context, folks who may not be involved may not know how to use them quite as well. So we brought down the barriers to do that. But also in that, we need to bring down the barriers for folks who may not have engaged in these kind of systems before. Mm-hmm. So, the folks at the URA and welcoming folks really looking at welcoming economies and how do we go beyond translating things into different languages, which is necessary. Mm-hmm. But also now trying to understand what kind of businesses does the welcoming community have and how can we engage them better. And this is really when you become more interdisciplinary and use the examples of childcare and in the welcoming community, but also small business in the welcoming community. And I think the entire team has done really well, and welcoming has given a real platform to show that many of the things that we're working on cuts across any silo. It cuts across race, it cuts across gender, it cuts across class, it cuts across abilities to really be able to bring those services to everyone. So it's a great example of how we do that.
Yeah, thank you for that. It seems so clear because, it's an interesting thought experiment to consider how a city or a mayor's office or a team might approach services or access to resources to a newcomer community. And you're trying to get an idea of the barriers there, like say language access. And you say, okay, this is something that we could do for things to be more accessible. But then with this work, there's this blend of, to Deputy Chief Lane's point, there's that thought experiment. And then there is the step of what businesses are there actually? So what businesses, what are folks doing, and how can we be supportive, or what are the connections that can be made? So Ala and Faye, I'd like to talk about the goals for welcoming Pittsburgh, especially moving forward, given these COVID-19 realities. What does success look like, and what are you focused on moving forward?
That's a good question. Again, what does success look like? I would say in continuing what we are already doing. One is making sure that we stay close to our community partners. I would say for just because, again, welcoming Pittsburgh is not just an entity on its own. It is a result of the collaborations and relationships that have been built over a period of time. So for success is making sure that we continue to work closely with our community partners, collaborate, promote in whatever capacity to make sure that our immigrant communities and partners know that the administration continues to stand with them, and will continue to do whatever we can to make sure that they feel supported. Also in making sure that we create the opportunity for transparency and hearing feedback from the community to help inform our work. Like we said, the goal is to make sure that we're fulfilling the recommendations that are in the roadmap. And even though the roadmap was launched in 2015, I mean, we're 5 years into it under a different federal administration. So there are a lot of complexities that come along with that. So making sure that we're carrying the community along and providing feedback as to what matters, what's more relevant right now, what do we need to focus on, what are things that need to change. The fact that we are implementing this recommendation, are we seeing effects in all the different communities, or is it just one community that's being affected by it? So again, making sure that we're transparent. We also have goals to make sure, like again, that we continue to give communities feedback as to what is going on within welcoming space. And we learned that from our Welcoming Pittsburgh Steering Committee that just rolled off the end of last year, and the fact that we need to do better with communication. So utilizing our social media platforms, as we work on our newsletters, we work on having a particular presence within our city website, is to make sure that we're using avenues to make sure that we're communicating with the public. We also kind of love the idea that we have now this weekly calls with community partners. And I know Ala and I discussed briefly even with some of our friends in the county as well, about how do we utilize this new change, this new wave of communication that we've had to create right during this time. How do we continue that process even well beyond? And the fact that we have this group of people that we get to speak and meet with on a weekly basis, how do we use that and continue that on going forward, making sure that we continue to know what's going on in the community, we continue to get feedback, which informs the work that we do internally.
Thank you very much. Alain?
That was so very well articulated. I have very little else to add. I think the only thing that I would emphasize is collaborating with people within the city. I know as Welcoming Pittsburgh has the privilege of working for the city of Pittsburgh, but there are people doing this work within the city that maybe we haven't heard about yet, despite the fact that our email listing currently reaches 90-some folks. Every single week we are adding more and more people to that listing. And so continuing to break down silos and finding the people that are doing this work and bringing them in so that we can all work together collectively, but then also outside of the city as well, working closely, as Faye said, with the county, with the region. So many of our immigrants might live within the city, they might live outside of the city, but work in the city. So it's just a piece of a greater puzzle, and I think it's imperative that we break down those silos and work together.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I'd like to talk, you mentioned the county a couple times at the very beginning of the call, the work around the census. What can you tell us about that and its importance just in general and as it relates to the welcoming work, the communities and folks that you serve day by day?
Thank you, Josiah. I should give you like an air high five for talking about bringing the census up. Of course, that's because that's been our world since 2018. With the county and the city. And the idea is the census tells us that historically there have been communities that have been undercounted, right? Our African-American population, populations who are low income, our immigrant populations, children under the age of 5 have been historically undercounted. And that means they require additional assistance to get them to participate in the census. But what we also know is because of that undercount, it equates less money being funneled into the region. I believe that the numbers is for one person that's not counted, that's $2,000 lost every year for a span of 10 years, right? So when we think about a child that's 4 years old right now, and the guardian or parent doesn't count that child, you think about the resource that child needs over a period of 10 years. But knowing because, either because people didn't know the effects or the reason why the census mattered, they didn't count that child, that's less money in the region to help that child as the child progresses through life. So kind of like the work with the county and the cities to make sure, like, one, we're again identifying who are the hard to count communities, who are the trusted leaders within those spaces. How can we make sure that we really speak to the heart of the census? We're trying to not necessarily stay away, but to change the language in how we talk about the census, and not just saying, hey, if you fill out the census, it means we get representation in the House of Representatives for the state. Because sometimes we've heard community partners say, well, great, but what does that have to do with me? Right? But when we speak directly to the fact that, hey, this impacts public transportation. Do you take public transportation to work? Do you take it to go see a loved one? This impacts infrastructure, right? Roads and potholes that we talk about so often is impacted by that. School lunch, school breakfast programs are impacted by the census. CDBG funds, our federally qualified healthcare centers are impacted by CDBG fund. Are impacted by the census. So when you start to speak a language that community partners can identify with, right? You can say like, oh, wow, like I never knew that all of those different resources were a result of the census. So again, we've worked with other community partners, our Complete Count Committee, so many other different groups, even the group within our weekly calls that we talk about, all get to hear about the census each and every time. And they've been doing great work to make sure like their communities, the constituents that they serve, know about the census, know about the importance of making sure that they count. And to echo words that one of our chairs mentioned, Greg Bear from the Great Book Foundation, talked about, you know what, right now, what the federal government is using in terms of allocating funds is coming from census data, right? So to be honest, even though in filling out the census, none of us could have ever predicted COVID-19 happening. But what was interesting that there was already a tool in place for federal government to kind of identify what is the population, who are the people that are there. So if you're left behind, if you're not counted, then according to the federal government, you're not seen, right? You're not there, right? Because we know that the numbers, data is what shows and what speaks for us, unfortunately. So we want to make sure that immigrant communities really stand tall, right? All of our hard to count communities really stand tall and say, like, I am here, and are bold to be able to make sure that they fill out that census. And what's great is we have a long period of time for people to fill out the census, and it's just going to census2020.gov, right, or 2020census.gov, and filling it out. It takes less than 10 minutes. It doesn't ask about Social Security, it doesn't ask about citizenship or that status. All it wants to know is you, your family, so that we could have an accurate count and make sure resources that are being funneled now and over a span of 10 years continue to come into our region.
Thank you. I want to hear from the rest. I just want to emphasize the point that you're saying there, where this is an opportunity for folks to participate in how, to a certain extent, the federal government, but our state and local governments, county and city, are in a position to assist neighbors with resources. You mentioned CDBG funding, other resources related to healthcare and stuff like that. This can impact, it indeed just quite literally impacts those realities for 10 years. And it's our chance now in the midst of this crisis to get an updated, accurate understanding on who is here and how those folks can be connected. Allah and Deputy Chief Lane, what are your thoughts too as it relates to the census and people participating in this season?
I'll say for me that the census is a great example of that, like, all of us are in similar boats, right? And when you think about everyone being counted, even something as simple as everyone being counted, acknowledging that for a variety of reasons, there are a lot of populations who don't want to be counted and don't have trust in being counted, right? And so what is the role of government, and in this sense, local government, and by extension, state government and federal government as well as county, to really think about how do you bridge that gap to have these conversations? How do you partner with philanthropy and partner with nonprofits? Because many of those nonprofits are the folks who are literally on the ground with communities, to being able to talk to them about these challenges. So this is, the census is a huge undertaking. And on top of it being a huge undertaking, which I think Pittsburgh and Allegheny County was really positioned well to do, then we get a global pandemic, right? But I think, we've been able to be resilient. There's been a lot of information just keeping up the conversation, and it's really something important to make sure that folks who don't necessarily see the benefit of being counted know that being counted really matters more than ever with the resources that you or your community gets, and how it allows you to get what you deserve in the city and get what you deserve in the country. And so it's just a really important component of the work that we're doing out of the office and in conjunction with the county, nonprofits and philanthropy.
Absolutely. Alana, any different additional thoughts there?
Once again, I think although I think that we acknowledge and understand that sometimes it's hard to trust government, but for all the reasons that Faye just stated, all the ways that you can be impacted by being counted. And I would just say that we've been working with so many different nonprofits and organizations who have become census partners, census hubs, committed to helping their constituents and the people that they serve on the ground be counted. That is further evidence of how important this is. This is not just about government. This is about community organizations needing the funding that they can get in order to do the work that they are trying to do, whether that's SNAP benefits, whether that's infrastructure, buses, all of these things rely on the census. And I would just say that it's see it less as a government thing and more as a thing that your community needs.
Yeah, a community thing. One of those, a conversation that we have so much around equity, a lot of it has nothing to do or very little to do with the government. How are you able to get to and from work? What services and resources are available for your children in terms of education? Where there's access to food issues, what can be done to address that? Who are the partners involved? All of those are conversations around equity that we all bring our own lenses to and are impacted by in different ways. And so this is a conversation not so static and not so simplistic as saying, just government. It really is an ecosystem of folks that are involved with this work. And when it comes to the census, you're talking about informing that through your voice around your identity and existence here. And then, of course, around the nation. I'd like to talk a little bit just about what success looks like for welcoming, because it seems like your ability to engage with more organizations over time directly and them being involved with your weekly calls. You guys did an AAPI call recently. You're doing this on an ongoing basis. Would probably be beneficial and would give chance for folks to engage and learn more about resources. How can folks find information on what you all are doing and engage with you?
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Josiah. But just to clarify about the Asian American Pacific Island, it's more so being led by the Inclusive Innovation team in IMP and Governor Wolf's AAPI committee. And Welcome in Pittsburgh, again, is just to show that we love to collaborate and promote in whatever capacity that we can. But it's being spearheaded by Inclusive Innovation and Governor Wolf's team. But how people could kind of keep track with us is to follow us on social media. Again, we have a presence, Welcome in Pittsburgh, on Twitter, Facebook, and on Instagram. So we'll encourage you to do that. We also encourage you to email us if you have any questions. If this weekly calls catch your attention and you want to be a part of that, please email us at welcomeinpittsburgh@pittsburghpa.gov. I'm sure it's going to be somewhere in the chat for you to see, again, as we work towards our newsletters and we work towards having more of a solid presence on our website. The way to get those updates is through social media channels. And of course, if that's not the way that you prefer, please email us again at welcomeinpittsburgh@pittsburghpa.gov.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to bring this conversation, to a close and just make space once again for you three to encourage those that might be listening. Say someone would like to get involved or is interested in doing so, but wonders if there's space for them and who they are. Maybe someone wants to share resources or what they learned on this call with folks. How would you just encourage people just in this season and also in relation to the work?
Yeah, I would say there's always room for one more person at the table. And to be honest, we don't control the table, and hopefully nobody does. Ultimately, what we're saying, it takes a village. It takes a village for everyone to feel included. It takes a village for people to feel and know that they're welcoming. And the more, the better. So please, again, if you're interested in being a part of the conversation, you have resources to share, you want to learn of resources, again, emailing us at welcomeinpittsburgh, welcomeinpgh@pittsburghpa.gov will be the first step, because then we could get you connected to the Welcoming Communities call. We could get you connected to the FAQ sheet that Ala mentioned earlier, and to be able to hear how we could better help you as well. But it takes a village, and the more, the merrier. So yeah.
I think I would say that the ultimate goal here is to get welcoming work and equity work to just be work. We are trying to build systems and processes that are sustainable and will outlast us, will outlast the office and this administration, and we need help in order to do that. Like we've emphasized throughout this entire call, we never do this stuff alone. It's always in partnership with some other community member or office. And so, yes, like Faye said, that we don't control the table. There's always a seat at the table.
Deputy Chief Lane.
Couldn't have said it any better than they said it. I'll just finally say that Pittsburgh is a city of bridges, and how do we build bridges between communities? And a welcoming community, welcoming work is a great example of building bridges between communities. We want to continue to build bridges between all kind of communities to create the Pittsburgh that everyone wants to see.
Thank you so much. Well said. Just a couple final housekeeping items. We will continue to post resources that have been mentioned on this call on an ongoing basis. You've heard that you can reach out to our talented team members via social media and via email. I encourage you to do so and to stay up to date on the work. We're going to continue these conversations as it relates to COVID-19 and equity and the realities that we are all facing here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County and the region. And in Pennsylvania, but through the context and lens of city government and the mayor's office on an ongoing basis. We will make sure that you all have a chance to learn about that as they get scheduled. Thank you all so much for taking the time today, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.